This is just a short presentation on piecewise functions in Excel. So let's start off with a simple piecewise function. These values that start the function that look like function rules, that's where our output comes from. Those are values that we call our range. And where we start our function, what tells us what range your output to use comes from our domain or our input values. And so what you're looking at is you start this function, you start reading it, f of x is defined by or is equal to 2x minus 4, providing that x is greater than or equal to 0 and less than 6. So all the way up to 5.9999 and so on, it's going to read from this first part of the function rule. But as soon as it hits 6 and all of the values above 6, it's going to be defined by x squared. So in Excel, what we do is the first thing we want to do is we really want to take a look at a reasonable domain. And our domain values are going to be a column that we set up for A, or for some of you, you like to set up your rows for your independent and dependent. But if you look here, A is my domain, and B, column B, is going to be my range. I've just simply skip counted by 0.5 to a number that's greater than 6, and here you can see that I've gone to 8. So take a minute and set up a spreadsheet so that you can follow with me. Okay, so we want to start entering our function to evaluate our function that we've defined by the piecewise function here. So we want to go up to the top of our spreadsheet and we will see this notation. F of x is actually where we pick up all of our functions in Excel if we can't just readily remember what they are. We're going to be using the if function. So you will double click on that fx and this dialog box will pop up. When that dialog box pops up, you can right here type in if, and if it didn't already appear in this index at the bottom, you would be able, it would come up for you. But because you see it already listed at the bottom, you're going to click on if so that it's highlighted, as you can see in blue, and then click OK. When you click OK, this dialog box now appears. We type in 3 different things. So those spaces would be empty at first, but what we're going to do is we're going to type in what we consider to be our logical test. So we've got this kind of boundary number. That 6 is a very important number in this piecewise function. Basically, we want to evaluate below 6 and at 6 or above. So what we're going to start with is we start with our very first domain piece from our function. And if you remember, with that piece, it was told to us that 0, it looked like this, right? It was x is greater than or equal to 0, less than 6. Well, because of the way that we've already defined our domain, we started at 0, so we don't really need to include this piece. What we need to pick up is that all of the values that we want to evaluate are either going to be below 6 or 6 or above. So what we want Excel to test is that the value in cell A2, because that corresponds to our very first input value of 0, is less than 6. So Excel is going to test that. because 0 is in A2, you can see this little statement over here, true, shows up. Don't worry about that. Type in your first test. When you go to the next piece of the dialog box, in this second space there, you want to put in what happens if in fact that is true. If the value in cell A2 is less than 6, you want to get its value from the function that we have as 2x minus 4. So 2x minus 4 would be 2 times A2 minus 4. Well, the way that Excel works is if it's true, it's going to give you one value. If it's not true, it's going to give you another value. So that's how we get to our third piece of the dialog box. What we want to tell Excel to do now is if it's not true, what happens? Meaning if it's greater than or equal to 6, we want Excel to return a value of x squared, and that's what you can see in the last dialog box there. Once you have all three pieces typed in, click OK. And just a side note here, if we had actually had our first part of our domain look like this, where we had our less than or equal to sign associated with the 6, the only way this box would change would be that we would type in A2 less than equal to 6. What happens is now that you've got your dialog box all typed in and you've hit OK, you know that the function itself that you've typed in is going to appear in the very first cell in B or B2 that corresponds to the input value. And once we have that typed in, we know that we will be able to double click and drag down. Okay, so now that we've double clicked, we can see all of our values in our range or our output appear. And if you remember, we used all the way up until the value of 6. Excel was evaluating with this formula in mind, 2x minus 4. But as soon as Excel got to 6 and tested 6, it was evaluating at x squared. So you could, if you wanted to, in your spreadsheet, you could insert rows above 6 and, put in your 5.9999, etc., and see how Excel evaluates it. But it will evaluate it using that formula, and as soon as it hits 6, it's going to evaluate it using x squared. So this should be just a simple presentation that helps you work with some of the piecewise functions that we use early in this course.